Terrific.
Right, I've got a message saying we are now live on Facebook. So I'll just do the introduction. So welcome everybody to the Monday night webinar of the Western Front Association. As normal, if you want to ask any questions, you can post them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen during the presentation, and we'll pull them all together in a Q&A session at the end. If I could ask though, please, I know a lot of people like to send their appreciations through using the Q&A function. It does make it very difficult when there's a flood at the end of the talk to actually pick out the real questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Andrew Lambert, who is Professor of Naval History at King's College. And tonight he'll be talking to us about Lord Fisher and the British Naval Grand Strategy of the early years of the First War. So if you'd like to share your screen, Andrew, and go on to PowerPoint. Okay, and then I'll disappear and I'll see you on the other side.
Thank you very much.
That's it, that's fine, that's perfect.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right, well, welcome everyone, and thanks for turning out on a wet and windy night to hear some stories about long forgotten events which didn't turn out to be a great battle. What I want to look at tonight is the options that the British state had for war in August 1914, the way that strategic options were contested, the way that the drift to the Western Front, the drift into a mass continental army, and the assumption that the war would be won on the Western Front through mass army combat, was contested by Britain's greatest strategic senior officer and Britain's greatest ever strategist. And to look at the options which have often been dismissed or reduced to something of a caricature by later commentators, and critically by some of those who were involved. If you want to know why this story isn't familiar, you need to read Winston Churchill's war memoirs, where he spends a great deal of time rubbishing this option, only to revive it for his own purposes in 1939 and attempt to reprise it. So this is about men of genius, it's about competing ideas, and it's about how Britain ended up fighting the war the way it did and what the alternatives just might have been. In the decade before the First World War, the War Office, the British Army General Staff, literally refused to take part in joint service planning. They refused to follow the lead set by the Committee of Imperial Defence and the statesmen who directed it. Successive prime ministers were unable to compel the army, or unwilling, one of the two, to compel the army to become a team player in the development of a national strategy. The army was convinced that the only route to professionalism was to follow the model that everybody then associated with Imperial Germany. Very large conscript armies used for large-scale offensive operations, leading to rapid battles of overthrow and the completion of victory within 6 to 12 months. The army was convinced this was what the war would look like next time round, and that if they weren't ready for this war, they would not have anything to do at all. By contrast, the Royal Navy, which was and remains Britain's senior service, had a very different strategic model, one which relied on securing command of the sea to protect the vital inflow of food, goods, and other resources upon which the country depended in peace as well as war, and then to seize the enemy's overseas territories and colonies, to capture its shipping, to cut its economic links and its communications with the rest of the world, both ships and also submarine telegraph cable links, and slowly but surely destroy the enemy's economy. This wasn't a strategy the Navy had thought up, and it was not one that they'd borrowed from the foreigners, unlike the Army's approach. This was based on 250 years of experience of fighting France, and before that, the Dutch Republic. Britain, as a small offshore power, had the option of fighting from the sea, where its continental neighbors, with contiguous land borders and relatively limited strategic barriers, certainly did not. So a German way of war was ideal for Germany, which was halfway between France and Russia, but it was not necessarily the correct answer for Britain, because Britain was not a small country off the north coast of Europe. It was the world's largest empire, and it also controlled the global economy. It had resources which none of the European powers could even dream of, and those resources would, in the fullness of time, produce Australian, Canadian, New Zealand, and South African troops, would produce an Indian army or two to fight in Palestine and Iraq, and the British would win the First World War, and they would win it precisely on the 8th of December 1914, because after that, the war in Europe is separated from the rest of the world. It is a very large war, but it is not a world war. It is now a European war on a world scale. It's the scale of engagement that makes it a world war, not the spread combat. Before the First World War, one man had explained all of this to British governments, the Royal Navy, and when they would listen, to British soldiers. His name was Julian Corbett. Interestingly enough, he was born in the year the Crimean War broke out, and he died in the year of the Washington Naval Conference. I think that bookmarks a great epoch in British history. Unlike other great strategic thinkers of that era, Corbett was a liberal in the political sense. He was a civilian. He had never seen military service. He had traveled extensively. He had significant personal wealth, and he was extremely well connected in the worlds of art, culture, and politics. He turned down the opportunity to sit in the House of Commons on more than one occasion. That really wouldn't have been a suitable place for him. He wrote brilliantly, first as a novelist, then as a popular historian. And from 1902 to 1914, he taught the Royal Navy how to think strategically. He reduced Britain's strategic experience, not the Navy's, but Britain's total strategic experience, to a coherent doctrine, which was published in 1911 under the title Some Principles of Maritime Strategy. This is the single most important strategic text ever written by an English author. And the word maritime needs to be considered. A maritime strategy is a national strategy in which the maritime dimension is preeminent. It is not a strategy for navies. It is a strategy that involves all forms of power, naval, military, latterly air, but also economic, industrial, cultural, and even propaganda. And Corbett would write some great propaganda during the war as well. So Corbett had been teaching the Navy and occasionally the Army and the statesmen how to think. He knew all of the leading members of the wartime government. Asquith, Haldane, Churchill, he knew them all. Edward Grey, very close also. So this is a man who is right at the center of British politics, but his closest connection with the war effort is with Admiral Sir John Jackie Fisher. And it would be the two of them working in tandem who would contest the drift into a continental strategy. Corbett was drawn into the war effort because he, and he alone, had a concept of how Britain should approach major conflict. And as he demonstrated, mass conscript armies had never been part of Britain's strategic answer to continental conflict. Britain had always found a different way. And he'd explained how that different way worked, particularly in a magnificent book about the 7 Years' War, where he demonstrated that Britain had won the war through economic, colonial, and maritime conflict and avoiding defeat in Europe. The Army took a very different view. The Army, which in 1914 had just finished the Curragh Mutiny, was packed with senior officers who were concerned about their future, their professional, their social future. And many of the officers, like the Director of Military Operations, Sir Henry Wilson, were Ulstermen who feared the breakup of the Union, the independence of Ireland, and the end of a conservative social order. Corbett doesn't fear progress, and nor does Admiral Lord Fisher. Fisher is a radical liberal, not conservative. And this is the key reason why he fell out with other admirals, many of whom were deeply conservative. So when war breaks out, a decision has to be taken. What is the British government going to do? Because it has no standing commitment to send the army to France. The only legal commitment the British have at the outbreak of war is the defense of the independence and integrity of Belgium. The Treaty of London was created by the British government to serve Britain's strategic interests, which were in 1839 to keep the French off the River Scheldt, which was the great invasion base for any attempt on England. The only thing that had changed in 1914 is that the enemy were obviously now the Germans. But letting the Germans have access to the Scheldt estuary and the north coast of Belgium would be a strategic catastrophe. And yet this is exactly what would happen in the opening weeks of the war. With the very small group meeting on August the 5th, late in the afternoon in Whitehall, we have a war council consisting of Prime Minister Asquith, Foreign Secretary Grey, Lord Chancellor Haldane, previously Secretary of State for War, First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill, and the Secretary of State for War, Field Marshal Lord Kitchener. There were also 8 other senior military officers in the room and 1 admiral. Given the stacking of the meeting, the outcome is fairly predictable. And it's all the more predictable because the man who spoke up most volubly in favor of sending the army to France wasn't Kitchener or any of the soldiers. It was this man, Winston Churchill. At the beginning of the war, Winston Churchill, who had political responsibility for the Navy and its operations, elected to subvert maritime strategy by committing the army to the defense of France. He did so because he believed, as many in the army and in many other places did, that the war would be over quickly, that Britain needed to make a contribution, that the best thing to do was to send all possible assistance to the French to bolster their defense against Germany, because the alternative would be the defeat of France and the creation of a hegemonic empire of Germany across Western Central Europe. This is perfectly comprehensible. But the idea that 4 or 5 divisions were going to make a difference when the Western Front sides were putting 90 and 100 divisions into the field slightly misses the point. The British Expeditionary Force was not created to do this. The word expedition should give the game away. The Expeditionary Force was created by Haldane after reading Corbett's account of the 7 Years' War. Its job was to conduct expeditions in support of maritime strategy. The capture of enemy overseas territories, the destruction of enemy overseas bases, and raids against enemy's coast, and particularly enemy naval bases. So the Expeditionary Force was not meant to be a static army. It was meant to be a mobile army deployed by sea. Or as Jackie Fisher famously said, the army is a projectile to be fired by the Navy. Maritime strategy depended on the cohesion of these 2 forces. The refusal of the army to join in any joint service planning before the First World War meant that Britain would go to war with 2 entirely separate strategies, which were wasteful economically and brought Britain to the brink of defeat in 1917. This was not the way to wage war. But in the minister's defense, Britain hadn't been at war for 99 years on this scale, and so we might allow them a little leeway. But to think that a meeting of 9 soldiers, 4 civilians, and 1 admiral was going to produce the right answer to the nature of British strategy was seriously flawed. And this was something that Julian Corbett understood only too well. The civilians didn't want to contest the expert opinion of the soldiers, and the soldiers outnumbered the single sailor who was in the room. And he had nothing to say because the First Sea Lord is the senior advisor to the First Lord of the Admiralty, and Churchill had already had his say and essentially had rubbished the naval approach to the war. So we have a clear break with pre-war policy based not on thought, on deliberation, but on sentiment, on an urgent need to support France. The passivity of Prince Louis of Battenberg, the First Sea Lord, was a disaster. Had Lord Fisher been in the room, one suspects that he would have spoken up and put a different perspective on the battle. No one in the cabinet thought that the war would last for 4 years. No one. They thought it would be over soon, and they rushed into the fight. Corbett realized immediately what had happened, and within days he was engaged by both the Admiralty and the Committee of Imperial Defence and he would end up directing the entire official history project of the British state in the First World War. He also wrote the Grand Strategic Narrative, which is contained in his volumes detailing naval operations. He purposefully restricted the army histories to tactical and operational level matter because he needed a single coherent overall strategic narrative where war, policy, and diplomacy met, and that was contained in his volumes. Tragically, Corbett's death in 1922 left the 5-volume set incomplete. Corbett's work finishes literally on the morning after the Battle of Jutland, which has left many to underestimate the importance of his work. But make no mistake, Julian Corbett controlled everything about this project, even writing the contracts which ensured that it was published, despite the opposition of men like Churchill, who feared it would damage their reputations. Corbett got the job because the Admiralty saw its role as critical in creating the official history, and it appointed Corbett, a civilian, to be their representative on the Committee of Imperial Defence Committee that would direct the project. The Army sent several senior officers. The Navy sent somebody who actually knew what he was doing. And it fell to Corbett to direct that project. At the same time, Corbett was heavily engaged by the Admiralty in writing strategic memoranda and explaining to senior officers how the war would work. One of his first jobs was to write the strategic overview orders for Admiral Jellicoe's Grand Fleet. The Chief of Staff, Sir Doveton Sturdy, simply lacked the strategic understanding to write such a document and the literary powers to set out his argument clearly. Fortunately, Sturdy was replaced shortly afterwards, and Corbett spent the first 6 months of the war directing overseas operations hand in hand with Vice Admiral Sir Henry Jackson, the pioneer of long-range radio. The two men had worked together extensively on strategic education before the war, and it was they who conducted the world phase of the war in 1914 with great success. Corbett worked from a place which no longer exists. It's under the bottom end of Whitehall main building. But Whitehall Gardens, number 2, which is at the bottom, just above Whitehall Stairs, some rambling Georgian buildings, almost opposite Downing Street, very close to the Admiralty, the War Office, and the seat of power. It was also within just over a mile of Corbett's house, so he was able to walk there every morning. This puts him within minutes of the Admiralty and all the other places he needs to be. And it's from number 2 Whitehall Gardens that Corbett will write the war. And it's there that he will write many of the key strategic memoranda that I'll be looking at as I go through this presentation. Corbett realized very quickly that the war had got out of hand, that the contribution of the army on the Western Front was distorting British strategy towards a continental model, which was entirely alien to pre-war British experience. He discussed this with Maurice Hankey, the Secretary of the Committee of Imperial Defence. Hankey didn't really understand the issues. He also discussed it with senior admirals, and the admirals were all convinced that the German fleet would come out and give them a battle, that all they had to do was simply ask nicely and the Germans would set to, and they would repeat the Battle of Trafalgar, wipe out the enemy fleet, and secure their place in history. Corbett had to explain to them that the German fleet's primary job was to defend the entrance to the Baltic and to prevent the British blockading Germany's Baltic coast, which would have broken its economy very swiftly. The Germans were only going to come out if they felt threatened in their home waters. He had made this point over and over again before the First World War, and among the naval officers, really only Fisher fully understood this, because Fisher also saw the Baltic as critical to an Anglo-German conflict. And remember, much of the naval planning for war with Germany, conducted without the support of the army, envisaged a war between Britain and Germany alone, a standalone contest in which Britain would have to develop the strategic power to defeat Germany if it wished to win the conflict. So the Baltic had been central to British naval thinking since the late 1890s, when Germany starts to become a serious naval threat. And it would remain so right through to the end of the First World War. The partnership between Fisher, seen here in 1904, as he enters the Admiralty, for the first time, and Corbett goes back to 1902, when Corbett was engaged in writing key papers promoting Fisher's educational and latterly strategic and technological reforms. Corbett doesn't write for Fisher, he writes because he agrees with Fisher. He doesn't need the money, and he certainly doesn't need to make enemies with other naval officers. But this is a partnership, an intellectual meeting of minds, and they share something very clear. Both of them have a long track record of being deeply hostile to Germany. Fisher refers to the Germans very critically early on, and Corbett says exactly the same. He compared the Germans to the Zulus in the late 1890s, and not to the advantage of the Germans, I have to say. Corbett had traveled extensively, and he was depressed by everything he saw of Germans and Germany. Imperial Germany was not his idea of a great country. So these men were not shocked by Germany's actions in the First World War. They were not shocked when the Germans broke all the rules of international law either. They had no time for this regime and its ambitions. Fisher, of course, was not in office in August 1914, which is a tragedy. He was actually in Germany, and he spent the first few days of August getting out of Germany, and the next few months getting his son-in-law and his daughter out of Germany. He was not recalled to service until November. In the interval, Corbett, whose health was always precarious, had undergone major surgery and was off duty for 3 or 4 weeks. He returned to find the war had started to take on a predictable character, continental struggle in which armies were going to dominate the agenda. But at the same time, Fisher had returned to control the Admiralty, and a run of unfortunate events at sea came to an end dramatically. Fisher took a grip on global strategy, used the tools that he had built, particularly battle cruisers and long-range radio stations, to ensure that Germany's overseas fleets were swiftly caught and destroyed. The Battle of Falkland Islands, December 8th, 1914, is the end of the First World War. As von Spey's cruiser, the Scharnhorst, goes down, with Gneisenau in the background, any lingering sense that Germany could pose a threat outside Europe disappears. This allows Fisher to concentrate Britain's naval and strategic resources back in home waters, to tighten the blockade of Germany, to get a grip on the North Sea, to stop the Germans using it for any purposes, and to begin his plans to open up the Baltic and impose a blockade of Germany's Baltic coast, isolating Germany critically from Sweden, upon which it absolutely depended for iron, steel, finished steel goods, particularly ball bearings, copper, and large amounts of food, and even horses. The German war economy depends on Sweden, and the sooner the British take command of the Baltic, the sooner the German war effort begins to falter. So this is a partnership of two men committed to the national interest. They share a strategic vision. One of them is going to lead this operation. The other one is going to have to write the papers that explain it. And it's that critical partnership that is central to what I'm going to discuss. Corbett explains that Britain's peculiar strategy hasn't become outdated by the introduction of modern technologies. Britain remains a global imperial commercial power. It is not a continental military power. And whatever the war does, it will not create a British empire on the European mainland. So Britain's interests in Europe are essentially negative. Britain's interests around the world are much more positive. So even as von Spey's cruisers are being sunk, German colonies have been occupied and turned over to the use of the British Empire. So the British Empire is advancing on a global scale. The front line from the outbreak of war has been the North Sea, and we see here the two choke points, the Dover Straits, which were closed on day one, and the gap between the north end of Scotland, Scapa Flow, and Stavanger on the coast of Norway, just over 200 miles of often fairly tempestuous water. As Admiral Mahan had pointed out many years before, Britain lays like a great breakwater between Germany and the rest of the world. If the Germans wanted to import or export, they would have to go past Britain. And as Britain had clear naval dominance, that was not going to be very easy. So the British are already undermining Germany's economy fairly slowly because they're watching the engagement of neutral powers. They don't want to alienate key neutrals, particularly the Americans. But at the same time, they're building up an economic warfare system using intelligence and courts of law so that they can block the import of strategic goods into Germany. The key choke point to look at is the Skagerrak going around the north of Denmark and accessing the Baltic. And you'll see there the Jutland Bank, which is where the great naval battle of 1916 was fought. The Battle of Jutland is about the Baltic as well, but that, as they say, is a different story. Since 1898, Fisher had shaped his strategy for dealing with Germany on the Baltic. And in 1905, at the height of the first Morocco crisis, he'd sent the British Channel Fleet into the Baltic without advising the Danes or the Germans, and the fleet turned up first thing in the morning at anchor in Swinemunda alongside the German fleet, in a perfect position to open fire and sink it. This was why Fisher's Copenhagen taunt about seizing the German Navy hit home so strongly in Germany. The Germans actually believed that Fisher would do this. The fleet he'd sent was large and powerful. It was commanded by Britain's greatest sea commander, Sir Arthur Wilson, and it really did frighten the living daylights out of the Germans. It changed world history. And that was only going a little way into the Baltic. The question going forward was, how was the Navy going to get into the Baltic, given that Germany had powerful military forces on land, and how is it going to keep access to the Baltic open? And this is where Fisher comes in. Fisher is not interested in battle. He's not interested in fighting. He'd seen far too much of it as a young naval officer. He knew it was random, it was expensive, and not necessarily very effective. He'd spent his career working out how to get what he wanted without fighting. And the Moroccan crisis deterrent sortie is a classic example of this. He got inside the heads of the Germans and really upset their equilibrium. They didn't know how to respond to his actions. The largest fly in the ointment is right on the right-hand side center of the slide, the Kiel Canal, a deep water canal connecting the Baltic with the North Sea via the Elbe, which allowed Germany to move its capital ships from the Baltic to the North Sea and back again without having to sail around Denmark. This strategic waterway had been closed in 1907, and the Germans had spent 7 years rebuilding it so that it could be used by the new very large dreadnought-style battleships. As soon as Fisher knew that the Germans planned to complete the overhaul of the canal in August 1914, he put that down as the date the First World War would begin, and he did so in 1909. Fisher knew exactly when the First World War was going to break out, and it was all about Germany having security in the Baltic. If the Germans couldn't move their fleet between the Baltic and the North Sea, they would either be exposed to attacks from the Russian fleet or the British fleet. That canal made it possible for Germany to think about the First World War. Without it, the war doesn't happen. The 1911-12 crisis is never going to lead to a war because the Kiel Canal isn't ready. So Fisher knows this, and British naval war planning right the way through the Edwardian era is dominated by getting into the Baltic and using that to break the German economy. In Churchill's version, Fisher's Baltic scheme was with the witterings of a senile old man who didn't really know what he was doing and had no intention of actually putting them into practice. It was an unrealistic fantasy. And Churchill's plans to send some obsolete battleships through the Dardanelles, by contrast, were a stroke of genius. This is pure self-aggrandizing nonsense. The idea that Churchill understood British maritime power better than Fisher is simply implausible. More to the point, it rather begs the question why Churchill recalled Fisher to office in October 1914. He did so because Churchill was well aware that Fisher was the only man in Britain who absolutely understood how to use British power in a strategic context. Furthermore, in 1939, Churchill would attempt to revive the Baltic Plan as a way of attacking the German war economy. He didn't do it very successfully because things had indeed changed by then. The Germans had an air force, which made a big difference to naval operations. So Churchill publishes his war memoirs, Naval Operations, as a direct response to Corbett's account of Churchill's tenure as First Lord of the Admiralty in the official history naval operations. And he does so after the deaths of both Fisher and Corbett. So the two men who know that he's lying are not in a position to counter him. This is the German backyard. The main naval base is at Wilhelmshaven. You can see up there the entrance to the coast. Bremerhaven and Cuxhaven were major commercial ports, but also used as naval bases. And the island of Heligoland, heavily fortified, is essentially a stationary battle fleet guarding the approaches to the German coast. And it sets a limit on how far the British can deploy their power without attacking the island. But in August 1914, the first major naval battle of the war, the Battle of the Heligoland Bight, saw the British sweep up the German cruiser patrols and sink the lot of them within gunshot of the Heligoland. Here's HMS Indomitable steaming at high speed, rushing into the action to finish off some of the German light cruisers. So from the beginning, the British assert their dominance of the North Sea. The Germans appear in a fugitive capacity, coming out to drop mines or occasionally bombard major fortified towns like Whitby and kill a few civilians. The Germans are just trying to provoke the British to respond by sailing into German waters and engaging with their very extensive coast defences. And the British are wise enough not to take the bait. As soon as Fisher comes into office, he starts work on a new strategy. That new strategy will require a new fleet, and it will also require control of the army. The expeditionary force needs to become an expeditionary force again. It needs to be deployed where it's absolutely necessary. The new fleet will involve modifying older ships and creating some new ones, because Fisher is not going to send the Grand Fleet, the backbone of the Allied war effort, anywhere near the Baltic. He's building a new fleet, some converted ships, but a lot of brand new ships to fight a very different kind of battle. His object is to have enough equipment by the spring of 1916 to launch a full-scale offensive towards the Baltic. And I use the word towards advisedly because Fisher did not intend to have to fight his way into the Baltic. Before he did that, he was very keen on clearing the north coast of Belgium, which the Germans were already using as a submarine base to attack British merchant shipping. This strategic catastrophe was the consequence of sending the BEF to join the French. The French were not interested in liberating Belgium, and the British were not capable of doing it without the French agreeing to it. In January 1915, Kitchener tried to revive this plan and was turned down point blank by the French. The British Army was now tied to a French war, and British interests were at a discount. Corbett had identified the importance of having an alternative fleet to carry out coastal and offensive operations and to keep the main battle fleet free for fleet-on-fleet encounters. In his critical history of the Russo-Japanese War, which he was finishing literally as the First World War broke out. It's a book of enormous consequence which arrived just too late to have a major influence on the First World War. He used the term a siege fleet, which he borrowed from the French, a fleet of ships which weren't designed to fight other ships. They were designed to project power ashore. They were designed to operate in coastal waters, and they were designed for strength and durability rather than speed and maneuverability. This would supplement the sea-controlled fleet of battleships and cruisers and other ships, and had always been part of British war plans against Germany. There would be a main battle fleet, and then there would be a separate fleet which would be used to attack German coastal positions. So all of this was well laid out in pre-war planning. Also in British planning was the use of submarines. This is the standard British submarine in the First World War, an E-class boat. So you can see this one's E8. These were overseas submarines, relatively long endurance, fairly similar to contemporary German U-boats, diesel-powered, battery electric power, torpedoes. And several of these boats were sent into the Baltic, and many more would have been sent had Fisher's plan been carried through. In the Baltic, they were highly successful, operating from Russian bases, an option which was available to a British fleet as well. The British didn't need to operate from British bases. The Russians had perfectly adequate facilities. These boats forced the Germans to convoy their iron ore traffic coming out of Sweden. So the Germans were convoying in 1915, 2 years before the British. That's how important this trade was to the Germans. And they violated international law in response to this, which also emphasized just how stressed they were by the threat posed by a few submarines. Among the ships that Fisher built were heavy gun armed monitors, motorized armored landing craft, and he rebuilt some obsolete cruisers for inshore gunnery fire support and equipped them with torpedo and mine-proof bulges. And we'll come back to that later. Fisher discussed his concept of a Baltic strategy with Churchill in early December, shortly around the time of the Battle of the Falklands Islands. And Churchill clearly turned him down flat and said that he wasn't prepared to wait for a strategy that would take 12 to 18 months to bring to fruition. Fisher's enthusiasm for coastal offensive vessels was something Churchill applauded, but he believed they would be used in a direct attack on the German naval base at Wilhelmshaven, an absolutely suicidal concept, only a little more crazy than the attempt to steam up the Dardanelles the following year. Having been defeated by his political master, Fisher immediately turned to Corbett to produce the paper he needed. In the meantime, he was building things like this. This is Marshal Ney, built in 1914, great speed, and it carries two 15-inch guns. These are the largest naval guns in the world. They're also being fitted to the newest British battleships. The ship has the latest fire control equipment, and the guns can be elevated to a very high angle and can engage enemy targets at 26 to 28,000 yards, which is just over the horizon. This is how you bombard the enemy coast from a long distance with the latest high technology weapons. These ships were the first outside the battle fleet to get full director control and fire control tables. So for Fisher, the Baltic Plan is not a standalone. It's part of a complex plan. The plan will begin in the summer of 1915, when the British Expeditionary Force, as large as it's become, will be deployed on the Belgian coast, and with the support of Fisher's first armada, minesweepers, monitors, converted older ships, will produce overwhelming fire on the German defenders and drive them back off the Belgian coast right up to the Dutch frontier, thereby denying them access to Ostend and Zeebrugge as bases for submarines and torpedo boats. The Expeditionary Force will remain holding this sector while the rest of the Baltic fleet is being built. This will include some really quite spectacular vessels. So on December the 17th, Fisher telephones Corbett to summon him to his official residence in Mall House in the Admiralty complex for lunch to talk over, and I quote, to talk over his project for hastening end of war by getting command of Baltic, combined with his method of making sure the North Sea. Wanted me to write memo thereon. England in the 7 Years' War was the model, and Fisher needed a powerful memorandum to win over a reluctant war council, and he brought Corbett in to write the memorandum. Fisher did not mention Churchill's role. Corbett wrote the paper over the weekend of the 19th, 20th of December, delivered it directly to Fisher on the Monday morning of the 21st, on the possibility of using our command of the sea to influence more drastically the military situation on the continent, developed Fisher's case for the Belgian coast and the Baltic. And Corbett states, I think in great detail, exactly how this works conceptually. He demonstrates that it's not going to be easy. He demonstrates that some of the key problems, like minefields, have already been addressed. The British had spent a lot of time looking at Japanese minesweeping operations in the Russo-Japanese War, so they went to war ready to deal with minefields. The paper was intended for the War Council, but Churchill would not allow it to be presented to the War Council because he disagreed with it. And in combination with Prime Minister Asquith, he blocked the presentation of the paper in late January at the War Council. And at this point, Fisher resigned. This is why Fisher will resign not once, but twice in this period. He resigned finally later in 1915. It's about British grand strategy. He's not resigning because he's angry with Churchill. He actually quite likes Churchill, but Churchill absolutely does not understand how Britain needs to fight this war. So it's a battle about British strategy. Churchill wants to fight on the continent and he wants the Navy to support that fight. And Fisher thinks the Navy is actually the primary strategic weapon system and that it should be driving the strategy and not the military. In 1919, Fisher would publish Corbett's Baltic Memorandum in his memoirs. And Corbett allowed this because it then allowed him to refer to it in the official history. And he made that memorandum central to his concept of the way the war would be waged and the way in which it could have been won. This was the lost opportunity that dominates his overview of the war. At the end of volume 1 of the official history, Corbett had sunk the German fleet at the Falkland Islands, and he opens volume 2 with a Fisherite statement of national strategy. And I quote this because it absolutely tells us what Corbett is going to say at the end of the book. He writes this in 1919. He knows the outcome of the war and he knows what's gone wrong. I quote, "Now that the outer seas had been cleared, the paramount need was to obtain a closer hold on the North Sea with a view to the possibility of ultimately pressing our offensive into the enemy's waters. Such operations would involve coastal attack and inshore work and required a special class of vessel." Germany's North Sea coast is remarkably short and distinctly unappealing as a strategic target. Its Baltic coast is long, exposed, and much more vulnerable. The British are not thinking about attacking North Sea coast if Fisher and Corbett have anything to do with it. So that means grabbing the Belgian coast back, driving the Germans back into their coastal waters and breaking into the Baltic. How is that going to happen? The Baltic approaches are in Danish territorial waters. There are 3 major channels leading between the North Sea and the Baltic. The Sound, which runs between Denmark and Sweden next to Copenhagen, the Great Belt, which is the major deep water passage, and the Little Belt. The Little Belt is between Jutland and the island of Funen. The Great Belt is between the islands of Funen and Zeeland. A British army deployed to the Danish archipelago, not the continental part of Denmark in Jutland, would be able to hold those islands with naval support against German opposition and hold open the entrance to the Baltic. That is the army's role in this strategy. It's to facilitate access to the Baltic. A British expeditionary force of 5 or 6 divisions would be adequate to this task because it would be supported by the Danes, who at this point would have been invaded by the Germans. Fisher intended to threaten to approach the Baltic, to send his armada on that mission, but wait for the Germans to respond by invading Jutland and bringing Denmark into the war. This would have broken Germany's relationship with Sweden, which would have taken Denmark's side in this quarrel and ensured the British could enter the Baltic. So Fisher is doing what he's always done, which is to get inside the enemy's thinking and to make them do what he wants them to do by carefully threatening them. As Corbett observed, the risks, of course, must be serious, but unless we are fairly sure that the passive pressure of our fleet is really bringing Germany to a state of exhaustion, risks must be taken to use our command of the sea with greater energy, or so far as the actual situation promises, we will probably lose the war. Corbett acknowledged doubts about the efficacy of economic warfare. The Foreign Office was restricting it, and getting into the Baltic would allow the British to impose a close and legally binding blockade without the need to annoy neutrals. The problem with this strategy is not its conceptual value or its strategic utility. It's that the British government wasn't willing to fight a battle with the army about where the strategic direction of the war should be. It wasn't willing to challenge its allies, and it wasn't willing to challenge the War Office. In this respect, Kitchener was a remarkably useful stonewall against which naval operations could be compromised. The flagship of this plan is HMS Courageous, with the sisters Glorious and Furious, ships designed to do one thing, and that is to steam through the shallow waters of the Sound on the Swedish side of the channel. The design requirement for this ship was that it displaced no more than 21 feet of water. And you'll see a big asterisk near draft mean at the top right hand, 21 feet and 6 inches. This ship was designed to steam at over 30 knots. It carries 4 of the heaviest guns then in service. It's not particularly strongly built, but it is designed to be mine and torpedo proof, as you can see from the section through the design. This is the initial sketch for Courageous, drawn by the Director of Naval Construction, Eustace Tennyson Dancourt, at Fisher's behest. This is Fisher's concept. It's a ship with a purpose. It's too powerful for anything fast the Germans possess, and too fast for anything powerful the Germans possess. It's oil fueled and can be based in Russian ports. The threat of this ship and others like it operating in the Baltic would certainly bring the Germans to their senses. Here are the Danish Narrows. You'll see there the gap between Copenhagen and Malmo. That's where Courageous was meant to steam. There's now a bridge there, which is on this chart. There wasn't at the time. And the Great Belt, or Stora Belt, between Zeeland and Funen, this is the main entrance to the area. And look what's right at the end of the entrance, Kiel, and the entrance to the Kiel Canal. So if the British fleet can get into the Baltic, its first job will be to take out Germany's primary naval base and close the Kiel Canal. From that point on, Germany will have lost the war fairly dramatically. Courageous was finished in the early autumn of 1916, somewhat delayed by the mobilization of skilled men out of the shipyards. And she entered service with her sister Glorious, and they took part in a battle in the Heligoland Bight in 1917. These ships worked perfectly and would have delivered pretty much exactly what Fisher was after. But instead, Churchill resolutely stuck with his plans, which were to support the army and to use a ramshackle collection of obsolescent warships to force the passage of the Dardanelles, an operation that Fisher, Corbett, and all the other intelligent people in the Admiralty absolutely objected to, on the grounds that it was impossible without a supporting army. Churchill, of course, wouldn't ask for a supporting army because he was responsible for committing all of the army to France. So Churchill forces through the Dardanelles operation. And as a naval campaign, it was almost excusable because it wasn't going to engage Britain deeply strategically in the region. At the last moment, the army did provide some troops, and it feeds into a much greater problem. Once the army is committed, it's very difficult to get it out, rather like the case in France. If you want to know what the core evidence for all of this is one of Fisher's documents. The First Sea Lord writes in green, and the First Sea Lord is pointing out that the Danes are building defense lines around Copenhagen, and they're very much like Lord Wellington's lines of Torres Vedras. The synergy there, I think, is critical. Torres Vedras protected critical strategic access. Lisbon was vital to Britain's war effort against France. Copenhagen would have opened up the Baltic and given Britain command of Germany's waters. So Fisher is pointing out the Germans have a very short North Sea coastline. He's pointing out where the primary target is. He's pointing out how the German fleet gets out into the North Sea from Kiel. And he's pointing out that there are Danish lines to be defended just outside Copenhagen. And of course, the lines of Torres Vedras were defended by British troops. So Fisher is making, I think, a very strong point. This document was actually created in 1917 when Fisher was summoned to the War Council to explain this plan yet again, and for the first time in person, to the political leadership. So far from it being an ill-conceived and rather foolish strategy by a silly old man who didn't know what he was doing, it was taken enormously seriously by Lloyd George and the War Cabinet in 1917, and stood a very strong chance of being revived in response to the First Russian Revolution, when command of the Baltic would have paid double dividends. Battle of the Dogger Bank on the 24th of January 1915 gives Britain undisputed command of the North Sea. Here is the Blucher going down after putting up a pretty sterling fight, but the German battle cruisers run for home, battered, defeated, and having lost one of their squadron. This is just the moment when Britain needs to be pressing on in the North Sea and using some of those obsolescent ships in the siege fleet to get a grip on the Belgian coast and to press on towards the Baltic. But instead, they conduct the Dardanelles attack. And here we are on March the 18th, just about the time that the weather in the North Sea would allow operations on the Belgian coast to begin. The Channel Fleet is now here. Instead of bombarding the Belgian coast, it's trying to fight its way through minefields and massive gun batteries, many of which are now manned by German gunnery ratings from the battlecruiser Goeben. This was an extremely high-risk operation with a very low likelihood of success. The British fleet had been through the Dardanelles in 1807 and the Turks ignored it. So why they were meant to take any more notice of it in 1915, I really don't know. But this is Churchill trying to find something to do. He's in a hurry. This is action this day. It's just not very intelligent. It wastes resources. Fortunately, it didn't waste too many high quality naval ratings. A few old ships were lost, but they were quite literally expendable. The reinforced disaster of Gallipoli wastes far more resources, but even that strategically had the chance of success. We could discuss that at more leisure later. So here we are on the day, 18th of March, Irresistible has run into a minefield and is going to sink very, very slowly from the ingress of water along with Albion. The British will lose 2 battleships that day, fortunately with very few of the men killed. The French will lose 1, which blew up. When the army arrived, some odd vessels turned up with them, some of Fisher's monitors, minesweepers. And here is HMS Grafton, one of those cruisers that Fisher had rebuilt as an inshore fire support vessel. This is a rather scruffy looking vessel with additional armor plate patched on the side, some bulges welded onto the side of the ship, and the extraordinary gear projecting over the bow is for minesweeping. The fighting top has the latest fire control gear, and her captain is a man called Fawcett Ray, who's one of the Navy's best gunnery officers. And it will be these ships, Grafton, Theseus, and Endymion, that will lay down very precise fires every time the Turkish army attempts to attack the British Gallipoli beachheads. In essence, the Turks couldn't do anything about the British army on the Gallipoli Peninsula because they met with overwhelming fire from the sea from ships like this. This was part of Fisher's plan, be able to lay down extensive fires from the sea to support the army, should that be necessary. And of course, when we get to the end of the Dardanelles, the troops left in X-lighters, armored landing craft built by Fisher to land British troops on Danish islands or indeed the Belgian coast. So the X-lighter, and here's one of them, there were plenty of these around by the time of the Gallipoli evacuation because the purpose they'd been built for had not been carried through. What are we to make of this? Was this a great lost opportunity? Was it a war-winning stroke? I'm not sure that we can be too confident that what happened was necessarily the right way of doing business. Fisher and Corbett opposed the Dardanelles as a naval attack, and they weren't overly impressed by the support provided by the army. The Dardanelles failed because it was impossible. The Gallipoli offensive failed because there were never enough troops. Offensive operations require numerical superiority. The Allied armies at the Dardanelles never had numerical superiority over the opposition, which made it extremely difficult. So what we have is the consequence of a disarticulated strategy, where army and navy are fighting separate wars, separate agendas, being directed by separate command systems. And down to the end of April 1915, the director of the Navy, Winston Churchill, is in fact wholly in favor of continental military operations and deprecates the use of troops outside the European theatre, in particular in France. Fisher resigned in order to get control of strategy back from the soldiers, and he specifically ordered that he would not serve with Churchill because Churchill was subverting national strategy by focusing on the army and turning the navy into an auxiliary of the army, when the whole purpose of the army had been as an auxiliary to the navy. That's what Fisher's resignation is about. It's not a fit of temper. It's not even a falling out between these two old friends. They remained friends to the end of their days. They disagreed on many things, but they worked together very closely long after the end of Churchill's term at the Admiralty, particularly on the Dardanelles Commission, where they gerrymandered the evidence to ensure that neither of them were blamed for it. In Fisher's case, perfectly rightly. In Churchill's, not so. Churchill was fighting for British strategy, and the paperwork he was using and the ideas he was using were those of Julian Corbett. And Corbett then was left to write up the war. And in 1918, he wrote to Fisher and he said, I thought when you came back that we would actually get strategy back onto its proper lines. We would actually have a maritime strategy. But by then, by late 1914, it was too late. The soldiers had got us committed too far, and we ended up fighting this ridiculous war at enormous expense. And as Fisher continued his campaign after the war, he died in 1920, the torch passed to Corbett. And one evening in 1919, Corbett had a dinner party at his house, and he was talking about the grand strategy of the war and the way the whole way the war had been fought. And his guest for dinner was a man called Lawrence, Thomas Edward Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. And the two of them agreed that the way the war had been fought in the desert was the proper British way of war. Everything supported from the sea, the flagship of a very smart admirals, Admiral Rosie Weems, had provided fire support, money, and everything else that the Allied army needed, and enabled it to operate effectively without the mass commitment of British ground troops. And in that conversation, which Corbett noted in his diary, one can see the beginnings of the conclusion he would have written had he not died in September 1922 about the lessons to be learned from the war, because the official history was a lessons learned exercise. What have we learned? Well, in Corbett's world, we have learned not to do mass continental warfare because it's enormously expensive in money, in treasure, and in the vital resources of the state, including people. And we need to do a more intelligent job of fighting in the way that we had in the past. So Corbett is putting forward an official history which puts the military operations in their place and argues that that was not the right answer to the question. How far Churchill learned from this experience is hard to tell. It's quite clear that Churchill would have stuck out on the continent if the French had shown any enthusiasm in 1940. Churchill was a continentalist. He was certainly not a maritime strategist. So Fisher and Corbett are fighting Churchill and the soldiers for the core of British strategy, and their defeat is something that we need to consider not as the aberrational ideas of a deluded old man, but as the result of serious study of national strategy. And they were indeed the basis of the way the war would have been recorded had the official historian lived to finish his task. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Andrew, can I ask everybody just to raise your hands, just as a silent show of appreciation.
Thank you all. It's so at a time like this, having an audience to engage with is a great privilege.
Well, I'll let you know, Andrew, you've had the best part of 500 people watching you tonight, on both on the Zoom session and in Facebook. So people have been raising their hands by way of silent clapping. If you could lower your hands. We'll now have a Q&A session. Andrew, if you'd like to stop your screen share, please. We've already had quite a few questions coming in. And what I'll do is bring the people up in little video windows. If people want to post the questions at the bottom of the screen, could I please ask you not to post appreciations? It gets very difficult to actually pick out the questions from all the appreciations. While I do that, I'm just going to, we've got Stephen Mason, who doesn't have a video camera. Right. So while I bring other questioners up, I'll ask his question for him. So he says, could Andrew say something about a possible liaison with the Imperial Russian Navy ships?
Yes, thank you for that question, Stephen. The whole of the Baltic strategy relies implicitly on access to Russian naval bases. As you probably remember, the Russians had lost most of their navy in the war with Japan in 1905. And so their fleet was at that point relatively weak, but they did have first-class naval bases, both in the Gulf of Finland and in the Gulf of Riga, from which a dominant British fleet could have operated very effectively. And there were also strategic links with Russia through the White Sea via Archangel, which would have allowed the movement of critical stores, personnel outside the fighting zone. So yes, the Russians in 1914 were quite effective in the Baltic. They captured the German signal book, for example, which famously enabled the British to explain how they had broken the German radio code. It's probably the case that they'd already broken it, but it was nice to have the signal book to justify that claim. And they were posing a problem for the Germans because the Germans had to divide their fleet between two seas, and that is a major problem for them. They're just about strong enough to fight a defensive battle against the British in their own home waters, but not if they've detached a battle squadron to deal with the Russians. So for the Germans, the Russian fleet is a big problem, and there are never enough German warships in the Baltic to be sure of defeating the Russians. They simply can't put enough good ships and people in the Baltic because of the risk of a battle with the British. So a British fleet in the Baltic would have been securely based. The British submarines that went to the Baltic served there for 3 years and were highly effective, and were only abandoned at the point when the Russian Revolution broke out.
Thank you very much. Okay, Peter, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Andrew, brilliant, very riveting. My question is about Corbett's book on maritime strategy, and I was wondering whether he was able, given the time it was written and the time preceding that during which he was thinking about it, obviously, whether he paid or was able to pay proper regard to what became a very serious threat from the German submarine force.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that question. That's a very good question. Some Principles of Maritime Strategy is published in 1911. It's written in 1910. It's written for Fisher. It's a statement of British strategic doctrine as it exists in 1910, 1911. And it doesn't project forward to engage with things like submarines and aeroplanes, because in 1910-11, they have no track record and you would just be guessing. Some people have said that Corbett ignored them because he wasn't interested in technology. This is nonsense. He'd written the best explanation of the Dreadnought only 3 years earlier. And his favorite nephew was a pioneer British aviator who was the first man to fly from the British Isles to Ireland and was killed fighting over the Western Front in an airplane in 1915. Corbett was well aware of all of these things. He'd seen submarines. He knew exactly what was going on and talked to the officers who commanded them. He didn't put them in because they hadn't yet proven themselves. And critically, the U-boat is only a threat to Britain because the Germans violate fundamental principles of international law. The law in 1914, and indeed long before, said that if you are going to sink a merchant ship on the high seas, you have to make provision for passengers and crew. It is a war crime to sink a ship without giving warning and allowing those people to escape. They are not belligerents, and sinking the ship with them on board is murder. So the British strategy can't take into account the idea that the Germans are going to violate the basic principles of international law. As soon as they do, the British employ some of their best authors to write the propaganda that points this out and make sure the Americans understand just what the problem is. But dealing with the U-boat as an illegal weapon, a U-boat as a legal weapon is utterly futile. How many passengers can you take on a 1914 U-boat? The answer is probably 2. It's a tiny little metal tube. You cannot make provision. Cruiser rules and for taking merchant ships are designed to suit big cruisers, not U-boats. So the Germans are using a coast defense weapon, which is what the submarine is, as a commerce destroyer at the cost of breaking international law. And so that again, and Corbett is a lawyer by training, so he was extremely well aware of the legal position. And you'll find that in the way that he writes and in the way that he argues. He is legally trained, both at university and was a practicing barrister. So he doesn't do this because it's not yet time. Had he lived to revise the book in 1920, yes, that would have featured. And he would have made that point. This is illegal, and it gives us the moral upper hand, and it means that the Americans are never going to come in on the side of the Germans. And this allows the British to stretch their blockade of Germany, to break the rules of blockade, which damages American business interests, but it doesn't kill American citizens. So the Americans ultimately realize that the Germans are killing people and the British are just stopping business transactions. And that gives them the moral high ground.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. Sorry, Brian, if you'd like to unmute and go next.
Yeah, thanks for a good talk, Andrew. It's most interesting. My question is a rather simplistic one. Quite simply, to what extent do you think Churchill was responsible for the focus of the army's efforts on the Western Front rather than anywhere else?
Right, thank you for that, Brian. Churchill's role in all of this, and the problem with Churchill, of course, is he gets a second go at it and he becomes a very famous great man. But had we drawn the line under his career in May 1915, he would have been seen as a catastrophic failure. So Churchill begins the war by sending the army to France. He then realizes belatedly that the army actually has to go and secure Antwerp. So the pivot point of British strategy in Western Europe is Antwerp. Securing Antwerp prevents the enemy using the Scheldt as an invasion base or a base for naval operations against, well, the Thames estuary, which is only 2 hours steaming away. He rushes off to Antwerp with an extemporized force of British naval reservists and retired Royal Marines to try and bolster the Belgian defenses. The British Army thinks about joining in this operation, the French simply not interested. And as a result, what should have been a strong position flanking the German advance on Paris is a position the Germans exploit to attack British shipping for the rest of the war. It's an absolute catastrophe. And Churchill, trying to clear it up after it had happened, merely demonstrated that he really should have thought a bit more clearly about this before he committed himself to sending the army to France. So John French wanted to go to Belgium, and he was dissuaded from that. French, after all, had started his career in the Navy, and he and Fisher got on quite well. French saw British strategy, I think, in a different way to his army contemporaries, who were absolutely committed to the German model of operations. Churchill's commitment, I think, is largely romantic. I think he has a romantic vision of war, which reflects his own military service at a relatively low rank in his experience as a war correspondent. I think he sees it as glorious and ennobling, when of course we know it's anything but. So Churchill's role in shaping strategy reflects his ability to persuade his political master, Asquith, that he knew what he was talking about. And Asquith was a very canny politician, but he had no interest in or grasp of the problems that war would bring. And he allowed Churchill to have his way, and eventually had to get rid of him because he'd made so many enemies. And Fisher did the country a favor by getting Churchill removed from the Admiralty, because he certainly was a menace. And he would have thrown the Navy into more stupid campaigns had he been given the chance. All the way through his tenure at the Admiralty, he was working on plans to attack either the island of Borkum or Heligoland, both of which would have made the Dardanelles look like a picnic. So it was well that he was removed. It would have been better if the First Lord of the Admiralty had stuck up for the Navy's plans in August 1914 rather than backing those of the Army. Very poor indeed.
Thank you. Thank you. Sarah, would you like to unmute now and ask your question?
Well, mine feeds in. My question, thank you again for a fantastic talk, feeds into that. What on earth do you think led him to acquiesce to Churchill's expedition in the Dardanelles? Because initially he was so against it, and later he said, well, actually, I was really against this. So what happened that he suddenly said, okay, sod it, go for it?
Fisher's willingness to tolerate the Dardanelles was, he knew the Dardanelles well. He'd been up the Dardanelles twice. He knew the defenses and he knew it was impossible. He fully expected it wouldn't even start. But the way the operation was conducted initially with long-range fire meant there were no casualties. It would be easy just to step back. It was Churchill who drove the process on and basically bullied the Admiral into launching the offensive. Fisher tolerated the Dardanelles because it was an alternative to Churchill's plan to attack Borkum in the Frisian Islands, which would have been an absolute bloodbath. And Churchill used the Dardanelles. He knew he couldn't stop. Fisher used the Dardanelles to stop Churchill pushing that plan because he knew it would be a first-class catastrophe. Whereas this had the possibility to distract the Turks, who after all posed a serious threat to Egypt and the Suez Canal, to keep them busy at home. It served some useful purposes, but it had to be kept under control and not turned into this full-on assault operation on March the 18th, when ships were lost and the initiative then suddenly drifted off and the army joined in and reinforced the disaster, which is one of the worst things you can do in strategic history. If you're already losing, put your hand up and retreat. Do not advance. Churchill never understood this. And he would do the same thing in the Second World War. If you look at the Dodecanese campaign, it's an insane campaign fueled by a combination of visionary nonsense and hubris. The Dardanelles starts off as a campaign where there would be an army, but it would be Greek. The Greek Prime Minister promised he could send the army to support the Navy capturing the Dardanelles. That would almost work, but he couldn't because the king sacked him. And Churchill just carried on with the plan without the troops. And it's, so Fisher is in a difficult position. He can't stop Churchill at every turn. Churchill's got the ear of the Prime Minister. Churchill's blocking his plans. So he allows him to open the Dardanelles because the alternatives are much, much worse. So it's a least worst option. It's not Fisher never, ever approved of it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Gerald, do you want to go next if you'd like to unmute?
Thank you very much indeed for an excellent talk on a subject that's long fascinated me. My question is prompted by the splendid picture of the monitor Marshal Ney, and that took part in the attack on Zeebrugge in 1918. And I wondered what Fisher's opinion of that attack was and whether he advocated anything like it before 1918.
No, thank you. The great Zeebrugge operation, St. George's Day, 1918, a lot of heroics, a lot of daring do. It's a kind of big boys version of how to fight an old-fashioned war. It's Roger Keyes all over. Very brave, not intelligent. Keyes was always where the fighting was thickest, and Keyes himself was probably the thickest as well. Brave and willing, but not bright. Fisher would never have condoned anything like that. It was just, this was insane. The operation itself was insane. The fact that it achieved anything was something of a miracle. All the other attacks failed miserably. Throughout the war, down to the spring of 1918, the Dover Patrol, commanded by Reginald Bacon, who was one of Fisher's right-hand men, one of his great gunnery technologists, the man who invented long-range fire control, had been bombarding these ports from extreme range with 15-inch guns. So in 1915, they bombarded the lock gates at Zeebrugge. They were trying to hit something about the size of a bungalow. They need to destroy the lock gates and the pumping station, and they missed by about 2 yards, firing from over the horizon. So they were developing some fabulous gunnery techniques. And by the end of the war, the largest naval guns in the world were being used to bombard Belgian coast. And they were 18-inch guns. So the British are firing at 33,000 yards with ultra high caliber and ultra long range artillery pieces under control. That's Fisher's answer to this: use technology, don't waste lives. So Fisher's view of war is we shouldn't have a war, we should have a big enough navy to stop anybody taking us on. And he certainly won the arms race with the Germans. The First World War is not about navies, it's about the Russian army. And if you're going to have to go to war, you need to get inside the enemy's head and make them do all the hard work. You have to frighten them into the things that you want them to do. And that's where the Baltic Plan is so important. The Germans will be pushed into invading Denmark, and then the British army will occupy the Danish islands. Game over. And if you look at the way the Germans respond in August 1914, when they think the British fleet is in the Baltic, it's quite clear they are absolutely paranoid about this. Rightly so. Fisher had spent a decade winding them up, and they remained wound up right the way to the end of the war. So that's long-term planning. It's clever, and it's playing to the enemy's weaknesses. If you want to fight, don't fight the Germans. If you want to outwit somebody, let's probably take on the Germans. Different countries have different strengths. The Germans are good at fighting, but they're not very good at winning wars.
That's a splendid question. I grew up in Dover, so I'm particularly interested in the Dover Patrol and that. But I think you come down as Zeebrugge being a stunt and no more.
It's a stunt. It was a publicity stunt. It was a very, very effective one. Everybody got very enthusiastic, and Keyes became a great hero. But no. Dover, the harbour at Dover, was built for the Navy. Right the way it was built right across the 19th century, from the 1840s right down to 1910, and it was built for exactly the purpose of controlling the channel and stopping the hostiles coming through. And that's exactly what it does in the war. But it also supports that amazing bombardment operation using monitors on that coast right the way through to the end of the war. So those monitors are providing the fire support for the Keyes attack, and they're almost entirely forgotten. Their contribution. They did far more gunnery than the whole of the Grand Fleet put together.
And were they broken up at the end of the war?
Two of them, Erebus and Terror, fought in the Second World War as well, and two new ones were built. So the British had 4 15-inch gun monitors in the Second World War as well, because they're absolutely essential to any kind of power projection from the sea. Erebus, Roberts and Abercrombie all fired on D-Day. Everybody thinks it was battleships and cruisers, but there were 3 purpose-built monitors there doing exactly what they were designed to do by Fisher.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Gerald. John, do you want to unmute?
Yes, thank you very much, Andrew. My question really is that what I can't quite understand, if we'd adopted a maritime strategy and not sending a massive army, or not so massive as it started out, France would have fallen, surely. I mean, although initially our role was subordinate, we did build up a pretty massive, impressive army. Would they not have been defeated at Verdun, and how would we have won the war then?
Right. Yeah, thank you for that. That is an important question. So in 1914, the British Expeditionary Force has no role in saving France. You can't save a country the size of France with 5 extra divisions. The French nearly give it away by suicidally incompetent offensive operations against the Germans in August, which which wastes over 1 million troops killed or wounded. The British can't compensate for that. You know, they've sent 120,000 men. They can't compensate for what the French are throwing away through their overly enthusiastic tactics. By 1916, Britain was in a position to put a large army in the field. But before then, Britain cannot stop the Germans conquering France. If the French won't do it, Britain can't do it. And remember, the force balance between Germany and France on the Western Front is never seriously favorable to the Germans. They have other fronts to fight on. They've got a Russian front to deal with. They're propping up the Austro-Hungarian army, first in Serbia, then against the Russians, and then in Italy. So the Germans have never got any spare divisions. And that's one of the attractions of pushing into the Baltic. Germans will have to move divisions to support that operation. And critically, if you go back through the history of Britain as a major European power, the British have never put a mass army in the field and propped up their continental allies. They've worked with them, but if they don't want to fight, if they're not able to resist, the British withdraw offshore. Look at the Napoleonic Wars, 1803, Britain had no allies, still went to war with the French. Fought the French down to 1805, the Austrians come in with the Russians for a few months, and then they're out again. And the British carry on right through to 1812 when the Russians are back in again. So Britain doesn't have to be in Europe. And saving France is not Britain's job. Britain's job is to save Britain. And blowing Britain's resources, human, material, and other, on a campaign to save France, for which thanks were pretty thin on the ground, as we said, doesn't make a great deal of sense. National strategy is national. You have to look after your own interests. Yeah, it's a good idea to help your neighbor when his house is on fire, but if yours is on fire as well, whose house are you going to look after? Yours or his? The British got themselves into a situation where they couldn't conceive of fighting the war without France as an ally. That wasn't the case. What happened in 1940? France was defeated, Britain withdrew, Britain persisted. Maritime strategy from an island base gives you enormous strategic advantages, and not using those is criminal. Behaving like a continental military power when you're actually an offshore maritime power is a gross waste of resources. If we had millions of men doing nothing who we could send to France, great, but we didn't. The economy was heavily engaged, and to man those armies, we had to strip people out of vital war industries, critically including shipbuilding. We nearly ran out of ships because we put too many shipbuilders in the army.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bill, do you want to unmute and go?
Thank you, Andrew. I mean, provocative from the point of view that as the Western Front, you know, we're normally used to dealing entirely with the ground forces and the army. I'd just like you to push you a little bit on the use of air and the Royal Naval Air Service. I think it would be fair to say that the Royal Navy were leaders in the use of aircraft, not only from the point of view of experience in East Africa, the details rather elude me, but also from the point of view of the use of float planes and pioneering the use of aircraft carriers. Where do Fisher and Stratton fit in this then? Because they seemed rather to have ignored these developments that were going on within their own backyard.
Yeah, thank you for that, Bill, and nice dog. So what I'm talking about is grand strategy, and in 1914-18, aircraft are not strategic assets. So the first serious strategic bombing campaign is the Royal Naval Air Service using twin-engine Handley Pages to bomb the U-boat pens in Bruges. So that's the first strategic air battle in world history. The Germans carry out a few terror raids using Zeppelins and Goethas over the UK, but they're not attacking strategic targets. The British are attacking strategic naval bases, and that's the Royal Naval Air Service. So strategic bombing was also invented by the Royal Naval Air Service, along with armored cars, torpedo bombers, aircraft carriers. It's a remarkably inventive organization because it comes from an organization that is progressive and technologically minded. And one of the reasons for the creation of the RAF was that the Navy was so far ahead of the Royal Flying Corps in terms of technology and its relations with industry, because the Navy is a very industrialized technological service, that the Royal Flying Corps simply couldn't get its hands on the aircraft, the airframes, and particularly the engines it wanted. The Navy seemed to have a monopoly on all the best kit. Unfortunately, the people who created the Air Force were Army land flyers. And the first thing they did when the war was over was abolish all the fleet, the Royal Naval Air Service squadrons, particularly the high-scoring fighter squadrons. All the best fighter squadrons on the Western Front were Royal Naval Air Service as well. So it's not a strategic asset until quite late in the war, and even then they don't win the strategic air battle over Bruges. Bruges is evacuated when the Germans have to withdraw from the region. So it doesn't reach that point, but the Navy's use of aviation is striking. The East African campaign is the use of float planes as spotters to sink the German cruiser Königsberg up the Rufiji River. Long-range fire from some river monitors, which had been sequestered from the Brazilians, used to destroy a fugitive German cruiser hiding in a forest. So the Royal Naval Air Service proved to be very adaptable, and it reflected its parent organization in that sense. And as soon as the Navy got control of its own flying again in the late 1930s, the Navy once again turned out to be far more dynamic and inventive than the land-based flying people. The Fleet Air Arm invented the entire equipment of the modern aircraft carrier, angled decks, steam catapults, landing site aids, and of course the ski jump we see now on HMS Queen Elizabeth. So the Navy, as a technological base, understands the use of the aeroplane as a multiplier. There's an aeroplane flying in a scouting role at the beginning of the Battle of Jutland. The first enemy sighting is by a seaplane. The sighting can't be reported because the radio is broken, but Lieutenant Rutland spots the enemy and he's trying to report them. So that's the first use of aircraft in a major naval battle. The first strategic raid on an enemy base to achieve total effect from an aircraft carrier, 1918, destruction of a major Zeppelin complex at Tondern, flown from HMS Furious. So very, very important and far more effective than the operations of the Flying Corps, because the Flying Corps started from the wrong place. They were not a technological organization, and they only acquired a lot of that technology base when they incorporated with the Royal Naval Air Service in 1918. It was not a good piece of business. In the Second World War, both the Japanese and the Americans had independent air and army air services, and both of them, their naval air services, were far more well equipped than the RAF ever equipped the Royal Navy for the Second World War. Independent air forces without a strategic role have no function. They merely support operations on land and sea and should be driven from those quarters.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you. Okay, with apologies to those still waiting, we've got about a dozen more people wanting to ask questions. I'm afraid, Ross, this is going to have to be the final question. So if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Hi. You may regret having me the last question. I suspect that there's not a single word of your strategic argument that I thought had any merit. In fact, I find it very difficult to know where to start in where I disagree with the central thrust of your last hour. Britain in 1900 had moved away from the very strategy that you suggested they should stick to, mainly because it was no longer pertinent, that actually they sealed the deals with the potential colonial enemies, and they could see their major enemy was on the continental mass of Europe, and that required a different solution to what they'd used in the past. And that's why we moved away. I noticed you conveniently drifted past the famous Battle of the Wilsons, which the Navy comprehensively lost to the Army. I noticed also, whereas you start at a point where the Navy must get into the Baltic, when it comes to individual assaults, each one is ruled out as not being suitable. And I was left with thinking, well, what is? And what you conclude is an operation which requires us to land on a neutral country to invite an enemy to attack us. Right, you will land in Denmark and wait for the Germans to attack Denmark as a way of beating your main enemy. That makes very little sense to me. In the end, I thought Denmark will end up as just a North Sea version of Salonika, a great big prison camp for our army. So in the end, I was just unconvinced. Sorry to finish off on such a negative note.
No, not at all. I'll go in reverse order because I think that will work best. Denmark would not be neutral when the British Army landed in it. It would already have been invaded by the Germans. The point of the operation was that the Germans would invade through Jutland, as they had on several occasions before. If you want to find a country in the world where they dislike the Germans more than the British have done in the past, it is certainly Denmark. Fisher had no intention of landing a hostile army in Denmark. If the Danes were at war with Germany, Britain would support them. If they weren't, it wouldn't happen. The 1911 argument between Sir Henry Wilson and Admiral Sir Arthur Wilson was not a resounding victory for the army by any stretch of anybody's imagination. The Prime Minister simply refused to adjudicate. It was a classic Asquithian solution. All the army got out of that was permission to continue a mobilization plan to move 4 or 5 divisions to France. That is not strategy. Strategy is about how we use the total national effort. And 4 or 5 divisions is not a useful national effort. And as for the Germans becoming the enemy, indeed they did. They built a navy. If they'd not built a navy, they would never have been the enemy. And by 1912, the Germans had stopped building their navy and had concentrated their resources on building against the Russian army. Germany was a short-term threat. We were never allied to France or Russia before the outbreak of the First World War for the very obvious reason that they were not our friends. They were just less likely to cause us any trouble in the short term because they were both petrified of Germany. So the whole point of the Entente was to restrain Germany within Europe by linking up with 2 other powers who we didn't necessarily trust, but who shared our interest in stopping the Germans cutting loose and invading France, Russia, or anywhere else. Ultimately, it's a short-term solution because Britain is a global imperial power. And if the Germans stop building their navy and cease to be a naval threat, they will not be an enemy that we have to worry about. We will very soon go back to, as we were by 1914, being more concerned with the Russians. The Anglo-Russian Entente had absolutely and catastrophically failed by 1914, particularly Russian actions in Persia and Central Asia had broken that relationship and it would not have been renewed. So the possibility of improved relations with Germany and collapsing relations with Russia would have changed the balance again. There was nothing permanent about the Entente system. It was a short-term solution to some medium at best term problems. And the idea that Henry Wilson was able to vanquish Sir Arthur Wilson in a debate, there is nothing in this. I've read Wilson's memorandum and he makes it very clear that if Britain goes to war alongside France, it will no longer be in charge of its own strategy. And he says this, the Committee of Imperial Defense in August 1911. Nobody gainsays that. Yeah? So Wilson didn't lose that argument. The politicians decided not to conclude that national strategy was maritime because they were, as liberals, somewhat wary of taking on the deeply conservative Ulster General Staff. So no, I don't think that was an argument that I minded coming last because it's an argument that I've had many times. Britain's strategy in 1914 is not made up of 5 disposable divisions, because if that's Britain's strategy, Britain has no strategy at all. Britain has a strategy. It has the world's largest navy, the world's largest economy. It commands global communications, transport, and trade, and it has resource bases around the world to command the world ocean. That's its strategy. That's what it spent its money on. it has the world's largest battle fleet, and that is a demonstration of your strategic intent. If you haven't built a continentally sized army before August 1914, that cannot be your strategy. Can't make strategy up when the war starts. You have to prepare for it. And the fleet that assembled at Spithead in July 1914, that is British strategy. But thanks for the question. That's a great question.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, but let's say apologies to everyone who would like to ask questions. Andrew, thanks ever so much. Very, very interesting talk. I certainly learnt a lot. If people could just raise their hands one more time, please. Thank you very much. Hands going up.
Right.
Andrew.
I didn't want to tell you all something you'd already heard, because I thought that would be a waste of a perfectly good evening.
Yeah, that was wonderful. So thank you ever so much, Andrew.
So the full-length version is imminent.
As indeed, I think is a book, isn't it? Later in the year.
The book is later in the year.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for everybody for joining in, either on Zoom or on Facebook. Just a reminder that we have got more webinars coming up. Next Monday, we've got Derek Clayton talking about the 21st Division at the Battle of Luce. And the following week, we've got Mark Connolly back. We'll be looking at battle tourism on the Somme during the interwar years. But for now, that's the end of tonight's talk. So once again, thank you to Andrew. Thanks to all our questions, and thanks to all of you for joining.
Yeah.
Good
Great.
night.
Been a pleasure. Thanks, Simon.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andrew.
All the best. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.